Have you ever wondered how, in the thick gunpowder smoke of early 19th century battles, soldiers distinguished their own from the enemy? They tell us it was a great war, a clash of empires, a battle for sovereignty. But stop for a second. Open any historical painting depicting Borodino or the crossing of the Berezina. Look closely at the details. Ignore the labels under the exhibits, and just look with the eyes of an engineer or technologist. What do you see? You see two absolutely identical armies. The same tall shakos, the same crossed white belts across the chest, the same knapsacks, the same epaulets, the same cut of uniforms. The only difference is the color of the cloth. But allow me to pose an uncomfortable question that makes historians cough nervously. Since when has the color of the fabric become a reliable friend-foe identification system under conditions where visibility on the battlefield, due to black powder combustion, dropped to arm's length already 10 minutes after the start of the cannonade? We were assured that Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander I were irreconcilable enemies. They painted us the ideological chasm between enlightened Europe and patriarchal Russia. But then explain to me how it happened that these enemies dressed at the same tailor. This is not a metaphor. This is a logical dead end of official history. To clothe an army of hundreds of thousands, you need a powerful light industry. You need patterns. You need standards. You need an approved uniform. Do you really believe that under conditions of war, blockades, and hatred, the general staffs of two different countries accidentally approved the exact same design of military gear, down to the number of buttons? Or maybe they exchanged fashion magazines right in the midst of artillery duels. This is absurd. Let's look at this from the perspective of production capacities of that time. To sew 100,000 uniforms of a specific cut, you need to launch a gigantic production flywheel. Looms must produce fabric of a specific width and density. Cutting shops must work from unified templates. Tanneries must supply belts and boots of a strictly specific pattern. This is a colossal logistical machine. And we're told that two supposedly warring empires, separated by thousands of miles and political barriers, created two mirror-image production systems. The Russian army looks like the French like the Russian. The only difference is that one was dyed green, the other blue. Moreover, notice that dyes are the simplest link in the technological chain. But the cut, hardware, shako hats, these are complex geometry. Skeptics will say that it was just pan-European fashion. Fashion? In war? Can you imagine Soviet soldiers and Wehrmacht soldiers during World War II wearing identical helmets and greatcoats, differing only in shades of gray, just because it was fashionable? War is above all utility and the need for instant enemy recognition. And here we see a situation where, in the chaos of a bayonet charge, when uniforms are covered in mud, soot, and blood, it's physically impossible to distinguish a Russian grenadier from a French one. They look like twins. This contradicts all laws of military science. No sane commander would send an army into battle that could be mistaken for the enemy. That leads to friendly fire and chaos. Unless it wasn't a war in the sense we've been taught. But what if there was no war between different countries at all? What if we have before us a single army of a single world system that for some reason split or was performing a police function over a vast territory? Look at the maps of that time. Borders are blurred, city names change, but soldiers are identical everywhere. This phenomenon of unification demands an explanation. We know that standardization is a sign of centralized management. Single currency, single system of measures and weights, single uniform. If the uniform is single, then the decision-making center, the standardization center, was one. Paris and St. Petersburg couldn't simultaneously come up with the idea to create such absurd and complex headgear as shakos, which, by the way, offer no protection against saber blows, unlike helmets. This is purely a decorative, parade element. Why would two armies preparing for death wear parade cardboard cylinders on their heads? Historians are silent about who actually sewed these uniforms. Where did the millions of yards of cloth come from? Where were those gigantic manufactories located that could outfit 500,000 people in a short time? They show us artisanal workshops and serf seamstresses. But that's ridiculous. The production volume for the Napoleonic Wars army is comparable to modern industrial orders. This is an assembly line. This is industry. And this industry worked from the same blueprints for both sides of the conflict. This leads to a terrifying thought. We are observing not a war of nations, but a punitive operation or civil war within a single global state that was subsequently erased from our memory. Recall how often memoirs of that time mention the confusion. Officers speaking the same language, French, soldiers dressed in identical uniforms. This looks more like suppressing a revolt than an invasion by foreigners. We're told that Russian officers spoke French en masse because it was cultured. But maybe it was simply the state language of that single empire. And the uniform. This is the uniform of federal troops that were thrown in to pacify a rebellious province, or vice versa. Remnants of the old guard fighting usurpers. Let's dig deeper into the technologies. Buttons. Seemingly a trifle, but on the uniforms of both armies, buttons are often found with the same symbology, or none at all, but manufactured by stamping on the same equipment. Metal stamping in the early 19th century. This is high technology. This means presses, dyes, advanced metallurgy. Are you saying that Russia, which we're portrayed as an agrarian bast-shoe country, had the same presses as industrial France? Or were all the buttons made in one place? If in one place, then who was selling them to both sides? The Rothschilds? Or some supranational entity that orchestrated this bloody spectacle? We need to stop viewing history as a set of disconnected facts and start analyzing it as a system. If you have two objects with identical characteristics, probability theory tells us that the chance of their independent emergence approaches zero. This is either a copy or a product of one system. The armies of 1812. This is a product of one system, and this destroys the entire foundation of the official version of the patriotic war. Because if the uniform is one, then the owner is one. Who was this owner? And why did he pit people dressed in identical clothes against each other on the fields of Europe and Russia? We're approaching the most interesting part, the issue of supply. Any military logistician will tell you that unification simplifies supply. If all your soldiers wear identical boots, it's easier to produce and replace them. Now imagine that the French army captures a Russian warehouse, and lo and behold, Russian boots fit French soldiers perfectly. Russian cartridges fit French rifles. This is not luck. This is a standard. A single standard of calibers and sizes. The War of 1812 is the first war in official history where we see total standardization of the armament and uniforms of the opposing sides. And this cannot be explained by simple borrowing. You cannot just copy a caliber if you don't have the corresponding machines for boring barrels. You must have the same technical base, and the technical base is knowledge that is not shared with enemies. Therefore, the base was common. Therefore, the factories operated in a single network. And this war was not at all what they paint it to be for us. It was a schism. A global schism, the traces of which were covered up with paint on uniforms and ink in textbooks. But the fabric remembers. The metal remembers. And if we look closely at what the soldiers were dressed in, we will see the ghost of a great civilization that was destroying itself. If identical uniforms can still be written off as the whims of mad fashion or a secret tailor's conspiracy, then what about the weapons? Here begins a real technical detective story that makes official historians break out in a cold sweat. Let's set aside school textbooks and take up technical handbooks of that time. The main infantry weapon is the smoothbore flintlock musket. We're told that the Russian army was armed with Tula muskets and the French with Model 1777 muskets. But if you conduct a comparative analysis of these two mechanisms, you will discover a frightening similarity. This is not just similar operating principles, this is almost complete interchangeability of key components. Locks, cocks, retaining bands, all this is executed with suspicious unification. But the most terrifying thing is hidden in the calibers. In wartime conditions, ammunition supply is a matter of life and death. If you capture the enemy's wagon train and its bullets don't fit your barrels, that wagon train is useless. However, soldiers' and officers' memoirs are full of mentions of how both sides actively used captured ammunition. This is possible only in one case, if there exists a single industrial caliber standard. Do you understand what this means? In the early 19th century, when we're told about manual labor and the absence of the metric system in its modern understanding, two supposedly warring civilizations use a single standard for barrel boring. This is like if today NATO and Chinese armies had absolutely identical cartridges that fit any automatic rifle. Such standardization does not arise spontaneously. It is imposed from above. A single standardization center is a sign of a single state. Let's go further. The language question. This is perhaps the most glaring fact that lies on the surface, but which we have grown accustomed to ignoring. The Russian nobility, officer corps, army elite, all of them spoke, thought, and wrote in French. We were indoctrinated that this was simply a tribute to culture, Enlightenment, Voltaire, fashion. But think for a second. You are fighting an enemy whose language is native to you. You give orders in the enemy's language. Your personal letters home are written in the enemy's language. In the heat of battle, in a stressful situation, officers switched to French. This is not fashion. This is functionality. French was the state language of that very single empire that was falling apart at the seams. Imagine a civil war, North and South in the United States. They spoke the same language, wore similar uniforms. No one is surprised. Why are we surprised here? The War of 1812 is a classic civil war, where the metropolis, conditionally called France, tried to restore order in a rebellious province, or two factions were dividing the inheritance of a global ancient civilization. That's why communication between officers of the warring armies was so easy. They were people of one culture, one education, one military school. They graduated from the same cadet corps, where they were taught from the same textbooks. The soldier, gray cattle as they were called, could be recruited from local peasants, but the command staff was part of a single global cast of managers. Look at the composition of Napoleon's Grande Armée. We're told, invasion of 12 languages. There were Poles, Germans, Italians, Austrians, Swiss. It was a motley stew of all Europe. But in the Russian army, too, the number of foreigners in service was off the charts. German generals, French émigrés, Scottish doctors. This is not a war of nations in the modern sense. This is a war of federal troops gathered from all districts against separatists, or vice versa. Borders were conditional. Loyalty was determined not by nationality, but by belonging to a clan or order. And now let's pose the logistics question that destroys the fairy tale of the Club of the People's War. How to move 500,000 people and tens of thousands of horses thousands of miles across trackless wilderness. We're told about mud, rasputitsa, and wagons, but any quartermaster will tell you such an army will devour all the food within a 60-mile radius in 2 days. Horse fodder is thousands of tons of hay and oats daily. Without railroads, without canned goods, without modern trucks, such logistics is impossible. Unless there existed a developed infrastructure that was hidden from us. Pay attention to the so-called star forts scattered across all of Europe and Russia. Official history calls them fortifications, but their shape, their location, is often senseless from the point of view of defense against the artillery of that time. However, they are ideal as logistical hubs, warehouses, nodes of a single transport network. Perhaps the war was precisely for control over these nodes? And that's why Napoleon's route meanders so strangely? He wasn't just heading to Moscow. He was going from one base to another, using the remnants of that logistical network that allowed supplying gigantic armies with unified provisions and weapons. We see a strange picture. Armies dressed in uniforms of one cut, armed with interchangeable weapons, commanded by officers speaking one language, moving along routes where mysterious star-shaped structures stand. And everywhere they pass, cities disappear. Not just wooden houses burn down, stone buildings disappear. We're told the fire of Moscow. But stone doesn't burn. Brick doesn't melt from the flame of a rushlight. To turn a stone city into the ruins we see on old daguerreotypes and engravings, temperatures and energy are needed that are incomparable with the capabilities of an ordinary fire. Here we approach the most sinister aspect. What if the uniform is not just clothing? What if the color of the uniform is an access marker? A marker for someone or something that watched this battle from above. In conditions where friend and foe are indistinguishable, color becomes the only code. Blues to be cleared out, greens to be evacuated, or vice versa. This sounds crazy, but look at the losses. They are colossal and do not match the description of the battles. Hundreds of thousands of people simply dissolved on the expanses of Russia. Died of cold? Of hunger? Or were they extracted? The facts scream to us that the official version is a screen, a crude, sewn with white thread decoration. They didn't even bother to invent different clothes for the enemies. Apparently, there was so little time to rewrite history, and the scale of the catastrophe so great that they decided to leave it as is. They'll believe it anyway. And we believed. For 200 years, we believed that the green uniform fought the blue one for the freedom of the fatherland, not noticing that both uniforms were sewn in one factory, and their owners were pawns in a game whose rules they forgot to explain to us. But the game left traces. Let's return to Moscow. But not that Lubok, wooden Moscow from Soviet films, but the real city that stood in this place before the catastrophe of the 12th year. Official history feeds us the tale about Count Rostopchin, who allegedly ordered the city burned, and about patriotic residents who themselves brought torches to their homes. But this version crumbles to dust as soon as you open albums with sketches of the ruins made right after the French left. Look at these engravings carefully. You see not the aftermath of a fire. You see the aftermath of a pinpoint high-temperature strike. Stone buildings are not just charred, they are destroyed to the foundation. Brick vaults collapsed inward, walls turned inside out, and marble turned into lime. Do you know what temperature is needed for granite to start flaking and melting? An ordinary wood fire gives a maximum of 800 degrees. To melt stone and instantly turn brick into a glassy mass, temperatures over 1500 degrees are needed. Where did such energy come from in a city heated by firewood? Eyewitness accounts from that time read like a script from a fantastic horror. People described a fiery whirlwind descending from the sky, not spreading from house to house. They spoke of glow that blinded the eyes and thunder that shook the ground dozens of miles away. This is not a description of a fire. This is a description of an explosion, or a series of explosions. And here we return again to the question of the single uniform. Imagine that the battlefield is not just land, but a proving ground. And soldiers in bright, unnaturally colored uniforms are not warriors, but markers. Red, blue, green dots, clearly visible from the air, from a great height. Perhaps the targeting system of the weapon that turned Moscow into ashes worked precisely on color differentiation? This explains why the uniforms were so impractically bright. In the mud of war, camouflage is life. But if your task is to be seen by the operator, you will put on white pants and a tall shako with a plume. And now let's look at what happened to the Grande Armée after Moscow. We're told, General Frost. They say frost struck, and heat-loving Europeans froze. But check the weather records. The winter of 1812 was not colder than usual, and real cold hit only in December, when the army had already practically ceased to exist. So what were hundreds of thousands of healthy men dying from? We read the medical reports of French surgeons: hair loss, loosening teeth, non-healing skin ulcers, vomiting, general weakness. In the 19th century, this was attributed to putrid fever and starvation. But any modern doctor, looking at this list of symptoms, will tell you the terrifying diagnosis: acute radiation sickness. Napoleon's army did not freeze. It received a massive dose of radiation in the burned Moscow and on the retreat route. They marched across radioactive ash. And that's why the Russian army pursuing them kept its distance. Kutuzov was sparing his men not from French sabers, but from the invisible death they carried on their souls. This explains the strange passivity of the Russian command. Why engage in battle with the walking dead? They were doomed anyway. Those who survived returned to Europe as invalids and died within a few years, taking the secret with them. And the world got the year without a summer, 1816, when snow fell in Europe and America in July. Volcanic winter? Or nuclear winter, after the use of weapons of mass destruction on Russian territory. But that's not all. Let's look at the demographics. If we believe the official censuses, the population of Russia and Europe after these wars did not just decline. A gigantic hole appeared. Not only soldiers disappeared, civilian populations of vast territories vanished. Where did the residents of the burned cities go? Hide in the forests? In winter, without supplies, with children? That's impossible. We are observing traces of a large-scale territory cleanup. The War of the 12th Year was an operation to format the hard drive of civilization. The old world, with its technologies, unified culture, and single management, was destroyed. The single army was disposed of in a senseless slaughter, so that no one would be left to defend the remnants of the past. Look at the architecture of buildings supposedly built after the fire. These are pathetic attempts at copying. Crooked walls, use of broken bricks, primitive technologies. Masters disappeared. Engineers disappeared. Blueprints disappeared. Humanity was thrown back in development by centuries. We still use the sewers and foundations from those times without understanding how to maintain them. We live in the ruins of a highly advanced civilization, calling them the historic center. And the most cynical thing is that the victors, those who pulled the strings, made us celebrate this catastrophe as a great victory. Remember the triumphal arches. They were built in both Paris and St. Petersburg. Identical arches. In honor of what? In honor of victory over whom? Or were they portals? Symbols of transition to a new reality where history was rewritten and people were turned into amnesiac slaves, proud of the colored rags of their overseers. We see a global collusion of elites. While soldiers were dying from the unknown disease on the Smolensk road, the top echelon was dividing the world. And notice, none of the monarchs suffered. Not a single palace of the ruling elite was destroyed by that heavenly fire. It struck only infrastructure, factories, and residential quarters. This was selective genocide. And here's another detail that makes you uneasy. Medals. Look at the "In Memory of the 1812 War" medals. Many of them depict the all-seeing eye in a triangle. The very same Masonic symbol we see on the dollar. It shines over the battlefield. We're told it's the eye of God. But why does this God watch the slaughter with such cold calculation? Maybe it's the client's signature? The very one who developed the uniform design, approved the calibers, and pressed the launch button when the armies gathered in the right place. The War of 1812 is not a clash between France and Russia. It is a sacrifice. A mass, ritual sacrifice, disguised as a geopolitical conflict. And we still pay tribute to this cult, studying false history in schools. But the earth holds the truth. And if we dig a little deeper than the cultural layer, at the level of that very clay that buried the first floors of our houses, we will find answers that will horrify us. Look down. Literally. Walk through the center of any old city, be it Moscow, Omsk, Paris, or Rome. What do you see? You see windows sticking out of the asphalt. You see full-fledged first floors that for some reason are called basements, though they have full windows, doors, and high ceilings. Official science calls this the cultural layer. We're told that over a couple of centuries, people trampled dirt up to 10 or even 16 feet high. Think about this nonsense. We're asked to believe that our ancestors were so lazy and unclean that they didn't clean the streets for centuries. And when the dirt covered the first floor windows, they simply used them as doors and built a new floor on top. This is an insult to common sense. Dirt doesn't grow upward. Dirt is washed away by rain. For the ground level to rise 13 feet, a planetary-scale catastrophe must occur. A flow of mud-flow mass, clay, and soil that engulfed the cities instantly. And here we approach the most terrible secret of the War of 1812. This war perfectly coincides in time with a global cataclysm that alternative researchers call the Clay Flood or the Great Catastrophe. What if the armies in identical uniforms weren't fighting each other at all? What if these were rescue teams, or more likely, cleanup crews and looters sent into the disaster zone? Imagine the picture. The world is engulfed by a wave of destruction. Cities are buried in clay up to the second floors. The population is dead or disoriented. Infrastructure is destroyed. And into these ruins march organized columns of soldiers. They have one uniform because they belong to one organization, the Global Predictor, the surviving authority that begins the process of inventorying the remnants of former greatness. They don't need to distinguish themselves from each other because there is no enemy in the usual sense. The enemy is chaos, disease, and feral survivors. Color differentiation of pants, that is, uniforms, is needed only for coordinating work. Blue regiments clear rubble in the west, green ones in the east. The battles that historians describe for us are possibly skirmishes with local partisans who tried to protect their property from federal looters, or the suppression of uprisings by those who refused to accept the new rules of the game. And then, to hide the fact of the catastrophe and the redistribution of property, these punitive operations were retroactively turned into the Great War of the Nations. Very convenient to blame destroyed cities on artillery shelling and millions dead from the cataclysm on combat losses. Look at old maps and engravings. We see vast spaces devoid of forests. 19th century Russia in photographs is a bare desert. There are no forests. The trees we see today are no more than 150 years old. This is easy to check by annual rings. Where did the ancient oak groves go? Burned in the same fire as Moscow? Or washed away by a clay flood? Official history is silent, but it cannot explain where the resources for restoration came from. And here emerges the theme of the new people. After 1812, we observe a strange demographic phenomenon. A huge number of people appear without kin or history, with primitive skills. They settle the ruins of palaces they couldn't have built. Peasants in bast shoes live among columns and granite embankments whose creation technologies are lost. This is like populating an empty planet, as if someone opened an incubator or imported population from other untouched regions. We are descendants of these settlers. We live in houses that are too big for us. We walk streets whose width is designed for giants, not horse-drawn carts. This version explains all the inconsistencies. Why the uniform is the same? Because it is the workwear of the corporation for disposing of the world. Why so many victims? Because these are the consequences of a natural or man-made strike, not musket fire. Why did technologies disappear? Because the bearers of knowledge died, and the new settlers were at the level of the Stone Age compared to the previous civilization. We were made to think that we develop linearly from rushlight to electricity. But the truth is that we degraded. We crawled over the debris of a spaceship, using its microchips as arrowheads. Recall how quickly Moscow was restored. We're told, in 5 years. Seriously? Without cranes? Without railroads? With horses? Rebuilding a 1 million-person stone city in 5 years is impossible even now. This is a lie. The city was simply excavated, cleared of clay, new frames inserted, painted over, and they said, "We built it." That's why many buildings have strange proportions, doors leading into the ground, and windows half covered by sidewalks. We live in an excavated world. And the War of 1812 was a cover operation for this gigantic excavation. But the most terrible thing is the erasure of memory. The survivors were subjected to harsh mental processing. The introduction of serfdom in its harshest form, precisely in the 19th century, is no coincidence. It is a tool of control. People were turned into talking tools of labor. Education was forbidden, history was taken away, and in exchange, a beautiful fairy tale about victory over Napoleon was substituted. We were convinced that we are a victorious people, so that we wouldn't ask questions about why we live in filth when palaces of antique quality stand around us. We were given pride instead of truth. The single uniform of soldiers is a symbol of our slavery. It is the brand that we were all part of one global camp that arose on the ruins of the free, ancient civilization of Tartaria, or whatever it was called. The masters of this world changed the scenery, redressed the guards, rewrote the textbooks, but left clues. Clues in stone, in clay, and in the cut of uniforms. They thought we would never figure out how to connect the facts. They were wrong. we began to wake up. And what we see is frightening. Because if there was one reboot, one cleanup, one flood disguised as a war, who guarantees that they aren't preparing the next one for us?